And we are good. All right, good morning again. Thanks for your patience. I wanted to make sure you understood how that worked. Ultimately, today's session is all about negotiations. The thing I want you to realize is that every day in our business and in our lives, we negotiate, don't we? We are negotiating at work. We are negotiating with clients. We are negotiating with our significant others. We're negotiating with our children. We're even negotiating with ourselves. And ultimately, we need to know how to navigate those negotiations. In our case, for our session today, of course, is in your profession, in the industry, with the clients that you're working with. How do we negotiate that? So there are a few things we're going to be covering today. So ultimately, we're going to be looking at tips on negotiations themselves. What are some of the tips that we need to take into account as we get started or prepare to negotiate with our clients and hold a conversation? Objections. Any of you get objections from your clients on a regular basis? We're going to talk through the objections. Objections really become opportunities to understand what we may not have covered with our clients. So we're going to look at objections and talk about those. A hot topic for today's market, multiple offers. How do we navigate multiple offers? How do we handle them? How do we communicate with all parties? We're going to hit on that. We're going to talk about contingencies, overall contingencies in a contract, whether it's price, whether it's inspections, whether it's short sale, whether it's sale of a buyer's property and seller finds suitable housing. Whatever those conditions and contingencies are that we deal with on a regular basis, I want to hit on each of them to help you be able to understand the nuances of them and be able to best handle them as you move forward. And lastly, we'll talk about some closing techniques, ways to communicate and be able to share with your client, what you're trying to accomplish and what they're trying to accomplish, and help them understand how to best accomplish it for themselves. Okay. I do want to mention, just so that you're planning, if you're planning for checking emails or checking voicemail or what have you, we are going to break about halfway just so people can get a coffee refill. And I'm very mindful of the caffeine intake. And, I also realize that, sometimes you have emails you need to return and what have you. So ultimately what I want to start with is the fact that any negotiation situation is emotional. What we can't forget, it's emotional for us, absolutely, but we can't forget that it's absolutely emotional for your client, okay? You can't assume they understand everything that you're explaining. I am, over and over again, I'm surprised at some of the most educated consumers that don't understand some of the most basic principles. And I'm not talking negatively about them. I'm acknowledging that sometimes we fail to realize that this is what we do, and they're not expected to understand it. Something as simple as delivering a deposit check after you sign an agreement. You realize a few days later you don't have a deposit check, and you're saying, well, why didn't you bring me the check? Well, and they're like, well, you didn't tell me I needed to, So, there are some of the most simple details in a transaction. They're not expected to understand how it works, especially if they're a first-time buyer or they're a first-time seller. So be very mindful of that in your communications, okay? Ultimately, it's important that we focus on the client's goal in everything that we do. Every communication should be focused on that. Many of you have heard me say repeatedly, we never talk in terms of we. When you're a listing agent and you present a counter offer to a cooperating broker, well, we feel that buyer has to come up. We feel that that's an unrealistic request. We feel that that offer is too low. You don't own the property. Okay, let's get out of the language of I and, I versus we. Get out of the we and get into the seller. My seller client would like to counter at. My buyer client feels that they would like to request the following repairs. Don't take that on. Quite frankly, it creates angst between you and the co-broke. It's not your decision. And we see many situations where we do question whether or not the co-broke is making decisions for their clients. I realize that. Part of it is only because of the language that we're using. So So always look out for the client's best interest. Look at what's important to them. What we need to remember is that ultimately underneath all of it, with all of those emotions and the navigating, it's all about caring. We always say, focus on the money, focus on the client, the money will follow. I actually said it reversed. How funny is that? We shouldn't even think that way. But focus on the client, the money will follow. You have to care about the outcome for the client. And if every part of your discussion is focusing on the caring and their goals, they will follow your lead. They will appreciate you. If at any point in the transaction it looks like you're just trying to get another sale and their concerns don't seem important to you, that it will be written all over your face. There's a saying that I've said many times: people don't care what you know until they know that you care. When you care, they will work with you. If it's not about them, they will see it and they will step back. They'll push back and ultimately won't follow your lead. Now, that doesn't mean they're always going to follow your lead. It doesn't mean they're always going to agree with you. But at the end of the day, if the sale isn't successful, it's not because you didn't care. It's not because you weren't looking out for their best interest. It's because it just wasn't meant to be in most cases. Doesn't take the frustration out of it. We have several folks that right now have buyers that have made multiple offers on multiple properties and still lose out on those properties. And how do you pick a buyer up after losing 8 properties to multiple offer situations? It's not easy. We can use the expression, well, it wasn't meant to be. There's a better house out there for you. When at the end of the day, even after we say that, we say to ourselves, I have no idea what I just said, but I hope it kept them calm, because at the end of the day, where's the light at the end of the tunnel? But we need to manage those emotions, and we need to help them sort through and make sense of it all. At the end of the day, most people end up finding the house that's right for them and it all works out, but it doesn't mean that's how it feels when you're going through it. So I want to make sure that we identify that there are different outcomes that come into play when we're dealing with negotiations. And ultimately, we need to, again, navigate those outcomes. So, everyone's heard the expression win-win or no deal. Well, that is great, because in a perfect world, everyone would win, right? Well, that doesn't always happen. There are situations where lose-lose. Nobody benefits from an outcome. A transaction that fails to close, an offer that fails to come together, both parties lost. The buyer lost because they didn't get the house. The seller lost because they didn't move on to their next chapter in their life because the sale failed to close. We have situations where it's win-lose. Ultimately one party wins, the other party loses. You're negotiating a price, the seller stays firm on their price, the buyer has to succumb to that price and pay more than what they wanted to pay. One party wins, one party loses. So I love the expression of win-win or no deal, and we hear it often. But we need to be aware that not everybody feels that way. Now, again, that comes down to us navigating those emotions and dealing with it. Above all, in anything that we do, and the baseline of anything that we do in our dealings, is the common denominator of client representation. Now, I don't want to turn this into an agency class, but everyone knows that I can talk all day about agency and representation. The key to every negotiation is remembering and understanding who you represent. If you are the listing agent, you represent the seller. I'm not trying to be funny there. Too many times, the sellers feel we advocated for the other party. If we're representing the buyer, we represent the buyer. Now, by the way, in each case, it's not an automatic. Just because you have a listing doesn't mean you represent the seller. You can actually take a listing without representing the seller. I know it's uncommon, but it does exist. Whether it's client representation or transaction facilitation, you can take a listing without taking on the liability of that client. Similarly with a buyer, you can work with a buyer as a transaction facilitator, or you can work for a buyer as a designated representative. You don't automatically have to become a representative of either party. But when you do represent them, you need to represent them. And it's as simple as the dialogue that you use. There are times when you're handling both in a transaction. Maybe it's a dual agency or a neutral dual facilitation. Because we by the way, I'm very excited to have as part of our class, we have some folks from other states here, and I appreciate them joining in. So ultimately, the representation, when you're handling both parties, whether you're representing them or you're facilitating or working with them, your dialogue is critical. Many times we try and substantiate the feeling of the other party. The buyer's asking, and part of the inspections, they're asking the heating system wasn't working at the time of the inspection. So the buyer asks for the heating system to be working. Now, mind you, that's a simple no-brainer, right? Well, except for the fact when you explain to the seller, well, you know, of course the buyer, they just want the heating system to work. Just those words alone make it seem like you're siding with the buyer. Now, that's a simple example. But there are times that go beyond that simple example where we're trying to rationalize someone's feelings or entitlement, and our clients feel we're negotiating or advocating for the other side. So it is important in every bit of the language you use when you're discussing things that, like I said, I call it blame it on your client. When the client makes a counteroffer or a proposal, you say, my client has presented this. If somebody says to you, yeah, that offer is way too low, it's not, well, we thought that that's where we would start. No, it's my client felt that that's where they wanted to start. Always speak in terms of your client, but always make sure your client knows that you represent them. And it can be as simple as saying that. You know, Mr. Buyer, I know where you're coming from. You know, I fully understand and I fully represent you. However, this is what the seller is presenting, or vice versa. It's all about that language. I actually had this conversation with one of our associates a couple days ago, because even in a conversation with me, it was, well, you know, I'm not going to do this, and we're not going to do this. The buyer's being unrealistic. So we handled the situation, and then I went back to the pronoun conversation, you know, and it's like, you know, make sure that when you're talking, that's part of the angst that's created in a transaction. How many of you have had situations where the co-broke, it feels like they're the blockage. They're the one preventing this conversation from even going any further. Well, we're not doing that. That's just ridiculous, you know. And I just look at them and say, okay, thanks for your opinion. Do me a favor, let me know what your client thinks. You know, sometimes we just have to step back, reposition our emotions, and just respond and help them understand. We always say leave a co-broke better than we found them. Help them understand that really we just need to hear from the client. Now, if you ever have a situation where you just feel, you know what, this offer isn't being presented, maybe, you know, maybe there's a broker to broker conversation. I've said it often. I love calling other brokers and having a conversation. So if you feel as though there's a stalemate in a situation and you feel that it may be the agent that's causing it, talk to me. Let's sort through it. But at the end of the day, it's our job to not only represent our clients properly, but to also work towards the common good. We always say work together. We need to work together. With cooperating broker comes from the word cooperation. And it's unfortunate how much lack of cooperation is out there. So, you know, whatever we need to do to find that or to initiate that in conversations, you know, make sure that you bring me in on it. Okay. So ultimately, when it comes to negotiations, there's a few things you need to realize. Okay. You know, and every now and then I'm just going to glance at the chat bar in case there's a question or you raise your hands or what have you. So, you know, feel free to share. So when you're going into a negotiation, always be prepared. Have your information in hand, have, you know, an updated market analysis. If you need to update, if a house has been on the market for a short period of time, you know, don't go in unprepared. You know, especially if it's a new seller, you're going in for a listing presentation and you bring in a market analysis and recent sales in the area. Make sure you've done your true homework. If you go in and talk about all the homes that have sold, and at the end of you looking at the comps, the seller looks at you and says, well, what about the house next door? Oh, what do you mean? Well, that one there sold last year. Oh, I didn't see that, you know? So make sure you have all the details. Now, keep in mind, next week we're starting our Mastering Sellers series. So check that out. We've got each session broken down, and one of those is, is discussion of pricing with sellers. Always present a united front with your client, whatever it is. I mentioned you represent them, yes, but what they want in the end, whether you agree with it or not, is ultimately their decision. So you need to present that. When a co-broke says that offer is ridiculously low, where did they come up with that? Well, that's where the buyer wanted to start. The seller comes back with a counter offer, says, I'm not fixing that. Ultimately the seller made that decision. Whether we agree with it or not, we need to stand behind it. Don't rally with a co-broke and say, hey, that's where the buyer wanted to start, but get a counter offer. I know they'll come up. Okay, that is not your place, right? Your place is to present the offer, and you can find a nice professional way to say, hey, that's where they wanted to start. That's what they feel the home is worth to them. I will always present a counter offer if your seller feels that that's less than what they'd like. That's not rallying with a co-broke. Okay, so further, when you're negotiating, always tell people only what you know. Don't tell them what you think. We all have an opinion, and we all know the expression about opinions. But it's okay to advise and consult with your client. But whenever you're talking with somebody, don't guess. Don't tell them what you think. You can say, here's what I feel may be the case, but let me confirm that before we move forward. Common sense has to come into play. But at the end of the day, make sure that you're advising them on information that you know, or information that you will follow up with the information, okay? Always explain details properly with your clients. Break all the details down for them. Make sure they truly understand, if it's financial, if it's seller net sheet, what have you. But ultimately, overall, you need to keep your client's goal in sight, all right? So I want to talk about some, different problem types, perceived problem types that we see out there in the industry. Any questions on any of the details we have so far? Okay, again, it's unique to be doing things through Zoom and doing it remotely. Normally in a classroom, we're able to be more interactive, but I want to make sure that we continue, regardless of the technology, that we're interactive here. So again, continue. Don't be afraid to, just raise your hand and share, if not a question, okay? So I want to talk about different, perceived problem types. There are a few of them out there, okay? We have doubt, we have indifference, and we have objections, okay? Now, the problem is that most realtors see all of those the same, and they're not the same. When we look at each one and break each one down, we can identify that they're just not the same. So doubt, doubt becomes a function of trust. If your client doubts what you're saying, maybe you're just not, you're not as convinced yourself, or you're guessing, your client needs to trust everything you're saying to avoid that doubt in your conversations, okay? We also have indifference. We have clients who are indifferent. If you have a seller who doesn't need to sell, hey, let's price it high, I don't need to sell anyway. Or a buyer's like, well, I got time, I'm not going anywhere. My first listing in real estate, I turned down because the seller had too much time on their hands. Agents in my office thought I was crazy. My first listing. They wanted me to list the property. Somehow I convinced them I knew what I was doing. I had no clue. But what I did know is that they wanted to price it way too high. And in that market, there were 13,000 single-family homes on the market. I want you to hear that number. 13,000 versus 1,600. They wanted to price their house $70,000 over what I thought it was worth, and I didn't even know what I was doing with pricing. And I turned them down. And the reason they wanted to price it so high is because he was retiring in 7 years as a teacher. And he said, I got time. I'm retiring in 7 years. And I looked at him and I said, respectfully, I don't have 7 years to wait for this sale. I can't do it. And they went on with another agent and eventually sold. And I want to give you one guess how long later they sold that house after dropping the price consistently. 7 years later. And the question I have for you is why? Why do you think that it sold 7 years later? Does anyone want to share? Raise your hand. Okay, Valerie. We're going to unmute Valerie.
Because that's when he was ready. That's
'Cause
when
that
he was
was-
ready to
that-
go.
That's when he was ready. That's when the motivation kicked in, right? He didn't need to sell before that. It didn't matter to him, you know? So, you know, it just ultimately it came down to whether or not he was motivated. Who else raised their hand? I want you to share as well. Tara, I saw your hand. Tara, unmute.
Oh, okay.
There you are.
Okay, so I was going to say the same thing, that at that point they needed to sell. I mean, he retired. Maybe they had other plans and they didn't want to be in that house anymore. So
Right.
once need comes into play, they're much more motivated.
Exactly. Yeah, they found that need, and in their case, they were moving to Florida, so they were ready to go to Florida. He was retired. He didn't need to be where he was. So you know, so that indifference changed over time with the growing need for them and their family. Exactly.
May I ask what it did sell? Did it sell less than 70,000?
Ironically, at the timing of the situation, because it was 1989, you know, and it was 7 years later, the market had actually been dropping consistently, but then came back up. So the value went below what I thought it was worth and then came back up. And it's crazy to think this because I had no crystal ball, but 7 years later, it sold within $10,000 of the price that I told them. And that's only because of the change in the market, not because I was wicked smart. So, you know, it was just ironic. By the way, just, you know, for what it's worth, I did list the property at some point along the way in 7 years again. They called me and said, you know, will you give it a shot? Will you give it a shot? We really, really wanted to work with you. And I did, and it was only slightly overpriced, but it was still overpriced enough to where it didn't sell. And then the next agent actually sold it. Actually, one of our associates was one of the agents involved in the multiple agents that listed it. You know, it's like, you know, we can share the drama. So, you know, but, you know, unfortunately, that's how it goes. But the best point there is that they just weren't ready. They didn't want to go anywhere. They didn't want to be inconvenienced, but they wanted me to be inconvenienced. So, you know, so that's where it was. So thank you for sharing. So ultimately, so that, you know, when we look at, you know, the indifference of it all, ultimately now it comes down to objections, all right? So objections, the key to an objection is that you know, it's an opportunity. I know it doesn't feel that way, but it's an opportunity to get further clarification from your clients, okay? So you need to look at the objection, you need to talk through that objection, you need to understand what is that objection. Sometimes people don't even realize that their objection is not an objection, it's just an opportunity for them to clarify something. We need to understand that not every objection can be overcome. And not every objection is truly a long-lasting objection. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are some times that you're going to get comments from your clients, a simple statement. Now, unfortunately, in many respects, in a lot of our education, we are taught that we need to overcome objections. When I first got in the business, they were objection handling techniques, OHTs. You know, we had to learn how to go right against an objection and handle it head on so that it doesn't become a bigger objection. And we find ourselves jumping in to overcome an objection. And sometimes objections or statements aren't objections, they're just simple comments. So something as simple like, this is an old house. Well, some of our training is, well, you need to jump right in. Well, it's not really that old of a house. You know, if you think about it, the sellers have really renovated a large portion of the house. And when you look at the mechanics have been updated, and they replaced the windows and they replaced the roof, and, you know, they redecorated. And so it really doesn't look that old at all. That's where we start. Oh, I don't want them to think it's an old house. Well, that buyer could be looking for an old house. And that objection handler that you just used could cause the sale, because that buyer could look at you and say, you know, you're right. It really doesn't feel like an old house at all. I'm looking for an old house. So, you know, this one's not for us. And you just thought you did a great job overcoming the objection. Okay. So, you know, some people will use escape mechanisms like, you know, we really need to think it over. You know, we want to sleep on it. You know, if people want to sleep on it, let them sleep on it. Okay, no problem. You know, should I call you in the morning? What time would be better? What time should I call? I totally understand that. Respect their process. You know, don't, you know, be on a listing appointment. You're talking through, you go through the whole thing with your interview and you go through the details. They say, okay, great. We want to sleep on it. Okay, no problem. I brought my sleeping bag with me. It's in the car. I'm going to go grab it. I'll set up in the living room and we'll talk in the morning when you wake up. Okay. Sometimes you just can't overcome that. All right. Now I'm a little facetious, but sometimes, you know, people will say, well, you just keep asking, oh, what is it about that, you know, this choice that concerns you? Maybe we need to talk through that. Okay. Well, what is it that's concerning you now? Okay. You know, at some point, they're not going to sign that night. In addition to not signing, they're not going to sign with you at all because you weren't empathetic. Now, by the way, get the listing every time, only if you want it. In that example, we don't want every listing. Just because they want to sell doesn't mean you need to be the one, you know, the victim to list it. Okay. But if you want the listing, go get it. And that's the mindset you want with any interview that you're doing. But don't try and convince them to do something that's uncomfortable to them, because at the end of the day, the next morning, they're going to wake up and call you and cancel that agreement. Okay. So, you know, acknowledge their concerns, discuss them with them, and make sure that you've at least handled the questions surrounding the concern. Their concern is real to them. Their need to think it over is important to them. If they need to consult with someone else in the family, by the way, if they want to consult with someone else in the family, try and schedule a follow-up meeting with that person in the family, because your client will never relay the details properly to help have that person who may be influential in their decision truly understand. If you're meeting with one spouse and both spouses are making the decision and the other spouse is talking to another agent, at some point, if you never get a chance to talk to that other spouse, then you may never have a chance at that listing. Okay, always make sure, whenever possible anyway, that you have all decision makers present at any interview that you're attending. Because ultimately, they you know, well, I'll talk to my wife and I'll get back to you tomorrow. You know, well, oh geez, no, let me talk to your wife. When can we schedule a time? All right. So talk through that and make sure that all their questions are answered. Okay. Also, always understand what they're asking when they say something. You know, help break it down and find out what it means to them. Okay. When somebody says, I need a big yard, you know, we immediately assume what we believe to be a big yard. We might think, what is a big yard? Okay, so when we look at that and we say, well, okay, well, a big yard might be a 1/4 acre, might be a 1/2 acre. If somebody lives on a couple of acres, a big yard might be 30 acres. Okay, it's all relevant to them. You know, I don't want to live on a busy street. Well, what do you consider a busy street? They could be coming from a house that sits right next to the highway, and a through street is really quiet to them. Okay, don't assume. Ask them, well, what do you mean by a big yard? Why is a big yard important to you? You know, when you say busy, you know, talk to me about what that looks like. You know, people say, you know, corner lot, and when corner lots were designed, you know, it was like the big thing. How many marketing ads do you see? Lush corner lot in pristine neighborhood. You know, what people don't realize is that the marketing of a corner lot was actually a reverse marketing ploy, because the corner lot was always the lot that was left over when developments were designed, and builders couldn't sell them because nobody wanted them. So it was like left over. If you think about it, a corner lot, you get twice the traffic. So they had to find a way to change the dynamic of that, and they created this marketing spin about a corner lot and how beautiful it is, and everybody wants a corner lot now. In essence, it's actually more noise. So, you know, it's all about the mindset. What's important to you? What do you want in a yard? What are you looking for? Okay, and why is that important to you? When people say a big yard, you may find that a big yard could be 8,000 square feet, because the yard they're coming from is only 1,500 square feet. So, you know, so don't assume anything. Always stay in curiosity and always seek more details. You know, and when we're handling objections, it's important that we properly go into discussion, because again, it's all about the retort. You don't want to retort immediately. Anything they say, well, that's not the case because of this. Well, that's not true because of this. Well, you need to really consider this. No, acknowledge their concern. You know, when you're talking and you're handling an objection, and I do want feedback on this after I give this example, you need to stop. You need to listen. Understand what their concern is. I always say 2 ears, 1 mouth. Use them proportionately. Listen twice as much as you talk. Okay? Listen. Pause before you respond. Don't immediately react. Okay? Pinpoint their concern. Repeat it if you need to. Answer their question and close for a decision. So ultimately, if somebody's coming at you with an objection, just listen. Step back, even if it's physically. Mr. Seller, I can understand your concern with that. I do realize that you feel your home was worth more than the price range that we just discussed. And I understand that. And that, you know, I can understand the disappointment in that. But what I need to impress upon you is that we've just reviewed all the marketing, the properties around you, and we've discussed the marketing range for your property based on what has sold in your neighborhood. So ultimately, if we are going to price it higher, then that's a decision we make together. But I do recommend that we price it in this range instead to get the optimum activity. How would you like to proceed? I validated their concern in that example, but also made sure that I provided my advice, because our advice to the client is important. That's why they hired you. By the way, sellers shouldn't hire you based on price. You know, they should get an appraiser for that, okay? Don't go in and just try to be the best price. Go in and be the best representative for the seller, because you can always adapt your price based on input they receive. They're hiring a professional to market and sell their property, not to come in and price it. And you can even discuss that as part of your dialogue with your seller. And we talk about that in our seller series. You know, it's about them finding the best person for the job, not the person who thinks it's worth the most, because anybody can put any price on any property. Agree? Anybody have any thoughts on that approach to handling an objection, or have you used that approach effectively? Anyone want to share? Valerie.
Yeah, it sounds like the, I don't know if I have the words right, feel, felt, found. Did I say it right?
You did, and we do hit on that. The feel, felt, found approach to overcoming objections. Yes. How does that work?
You know, I understand how you feel. A lot of people have felt that way also, but what we found is that whatever.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's acknowledgement. I understand how you feel, Mr. Seller, and quite frankly, others have felt that way too. But what we found in real estate is if we price your property $70,000 over what its value is, we may not get the activity that we had hoped for. You know, so great. Thank you for sharing that, because that's falls right along line with that technique. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thanks. So Moving along, the situations that we deal with in our business, okay? Writing an offer, okay? Remember, everything that we do, we're negotiating. Every conversation that you're having with your buyer or seller, you're negotiating. Always set expectations up front. At the beginning of your relationship with a buyer, when you first consult with them and do a buyer interview, make sure they understand the whole process start to finish. Same thing with a seller. You know, if you think about it, we do this stand out presentation to our seller clients. We do a seller interview. We go there with a resume package. We talk about the process. We talk about pricing. We advise them. For some reason, we just get buyers out and we say, hey, let's go look at houses. You know, we need to be consulting with the buyer, so we set their expectations up front. So when it comes to negotiations, I'm going to toggle between the buyers and the sellers. And right now, I want to talk about writing an offer. Okay? When you're writing an offer, you need to make sure that you identify the details that are important to the buyer. Okay? This is about them, not about you. They have to determine the details that they want to put in their offer. You've got to help them determine what those details are, but ultimately it's theirs. You need to consult with them on the price. What do they feel the value is based on the research that you're providing? What is the closing date that they would like to see? Don't just tell them, we'll put in 30 days, see what the seller says. Talk to them about the benefits and the pitfalls of closing within 30 days. 30 days is a really short time frame in today's market. You know, so don't just go out and say every sale should be 30 days. I have actually heard agents say, oh, we do that with all our buyers. We do that for all of our buyers. Okay, well, you don't do anything for all your buyers unless all of your buyers have agreed with what you're suggesting. Okay, they own the outcome, not you. Okay, so it might be how you negotiate inspections. It might be, you know, the example I'm using is appraisal. Appraisal. How many of you schedule an appraisal after an inspection time frame so the buyer doesn't waste money on an appraisal if we don't get through inspections? You can wave at me. Anyone? Okay. I urge you to realize that that buyer needs to be part of that decision. By the way, I agree with the concept of that, because if you're not going to pass inspections, why spend money on an appraisal? But you need to know that if you asked for the appraisal to be delayed because of the inspections, and the inspection clause takes more than the 10 days because of extensions and issues, and now that time frame of inspections continues to where you're close to your financing contingency, your buyer may not get their financing approval in time, and it's because you chose to delay the appraisal. So be very careful when you decide this is how we want to do this. Speak to the buyer in this case. Now, it's okay if you raised your hand and said, you know, that, yeah, that's what I do, because in concept, I support what you're thinking. But if that buyer can't get approval and the seller is not willing to extend their financing contingency because the seller may have a backup offer, then the question is, in that example, who caused that buyer to lose that house? It's the person who decided to hold off on the appraisal. So make sure your client is part of the decision. When we're talking about offers, it's about every contingency. Mr. Buyer, let's discuss these financing contingencies and let's explain them. You know, by the way, when we're representing a buyer in our financing, it's very important that we talk about those details because we need to dictate the buyer's safety with those financing contingencies. So when it comes to the financing contingency, we need to identify the timeline from which the buyer needs to get their commitment, and also a ceiling or a cap interest rate to protect the buyer if the rates went up overnight. The buyer is only qualified up to a certain point or only wants to spend a certain point up to a certain point monthly. We need to make sure that we talk through that and put all the details in. So, you know, every transactional detail, explain it to them at that time, and ultimately go through it so that this offer is truly theirs. You didn't just write it up and send to them. Make sense? Okay. You will find things that will come up later. You know, even something as simple as deposits. You know, who determines how much of a deposit the buyer's putting down on an agreement? The buyer. Not you, not the market, not the listing agent, not the seller. Now the seller may counteroffer and say that's not enough. And you may need to educate the buyer and say common in the industry might be, because there's no standard, keep in mind, there's no standard in real estate. You know, common in the industry might be 5,000, it might be 3%, it might be 5% in certain categories of properties. You know, but you can advise the buyer and say common in the industry is this range. What would you feel comfortable with? You know, so it's not about, hey, let's do this. Let's do 1,000, you know, see what they say, you know, because the seller may say this buyer can't afford my house. They can't even afford to put a deposit down. Let's take the other offer. Okay. So you see where I'm going with it. It's truly important that the client owns every contingency there so that, and by the way, you have to advise them because they don't know, but ultimately they need to agree with it. Make sense? Okay. Flip side of it, presenting the offer. Okay. When you're presenting the offer to your seller, that's a buyer client. Okay. Presenting the offer to your seller, you need to understand every detail. And honestly, you should be sending offers to your sellers. The seller has the right to see every offer that's presented. Don't paraphrase and forget something. Okay. So make sure you're reviewing every detail. Now, by the way, when we get into multiple offers, I mean, it's not easy. None of this is easy, you know, especially if you have 19 offers to discuss with a seller. Okay. The most I've heard recently is 19. That's why I say it. Okay. The most I've had in my career, I believe, was 28. Not easy, but the seller needs to know all of the details and the benefits of all of them. Okay. So review each contingency with the seller. Understand what the buyer's financing details are. By the way, it's okay for you as a listing agent to call the buyer's lender to confirm their qualifications, not to get confidential information, but to confirm those qualifications. Make sure that credit has been pulled. Make sure that the lender feels comfortable with their qualification for this house, because a pre-approval letter does not pertain to any particular house. Hopefully the buyer's agent and you as a buyer's agent are getting a pre-approval for each and every house that these buyers make an offer. So I know you don't want to inconvenience the loan officer, inconvenience them. It's their job, it's their client too. Okay, so have it specific to the property. When you're talking to sellers, you need to understand there might be objections that come along and you need to be prepared to handle them, be prepared to discuss them. And more importantly than anything, your seller needs to know what the risks are in any decision that they make, okay? So who can tell me the 3 choices a seller has when responding to an offer? Raise your hand. Seller has 3 choices. D.
The seller can accept, they can counter, or they can just decline the offer.
That's exactly right. They can accept, reject, or counter. Thank you, Dee. That's awesome. The key to that is what are the risks of each? So Dee, do you mind sharing with me? What are the
Sure.
risks? What are the risks in accepting an offer?
Well, if they accept an offer, it could be that they could have gotten a higher price on their home if they had waited it out a little bit, or maybe they should have countered and see, you know, if they didn't get full price, maybe it would be to their advantage to counter.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. No, that's perfect. That's well said, because, you know, at the end of the day, we think, well, what's the downside to accepting? Now, if that buyer is going to perform and that seller is comfortable with those details, there really isn't any downside to that, is there?
No.
No, not a trick question. No, because we think about it. But at the end of the day, those concerns are valid. Is the seller in the back of their mind saying, well, what if? Yeah, they are. You need to handle that with them.
Right.
You know, you need to almost predict what their concerns are and talk to them about it. Okay. So what's the downside to declining, Dee?
The down to that would be if they had no backup or no other offers on the table. You know, they decline a really,
Let's say it's a good offer and they decline it, or solid buyer status, maybe the price just isn't enough for them. What's their downside?
they may never see it again.
They may never see it again, but that's right. But they also, they don't what? Move.
Right.
Assuming
That's
they live
right.
in the property. So the downside is they're not going anywhere.
Right.
All right. Now, so humor me now with the counter offer. What do we need to know about countering? What are the downsides to countering?
Uh, well,
Nothing immediate, right?
the buyer might change their mind if, they may just say, oh, I gave them my best offer and the seller says no, and they may just get all emotional and just decide to move on.
Right. Yeah. Buyer remorse.
Right.
Yep. What we need to realize, gang, is along those lines, Dee, a counter offer is a rejection of an offer. Plain
Right.
and simple. It
Yeah.
says to the buyer, I don't want that offer. I want this offer if you're willing to accept it. But it is a rejection of the offer. Now, at the end of the day, nobody's signed any contract. So it's not like you lost a sale that you already had. But the buyer, if the seller doesn't like it, the seller makes a counter offer. The buyer's offer is rejected. By the way, the buyer can't just come back and again, nothing's signed, but the buyer just can't come back and say, oh, well then, no, I'll go with my original offer. I'll go with my original offer. It's too late. It's already off the table. So
Right.
if there are multiple offers and the seller counters, should only counter to one. You don't counter to multiple buyers, because if everybody accepts that seller's counter, you've just turned it into a multifamily. Okay? So you have to be mindful that when the seller says no, it means no. It may say no, but what if? But the what if may never come to be. Does it make sense? So a counter offer is a rejection of an offer. True? Awesome. Cool. Dee, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have anything to share? Christina.
Yeah, so you just mentioned that only counter to one offer. I've had in the past the listing agent come back to us and pretty much give like an ultimatum of this is the seller's counter offer. I've told you and the other offer on the table, and the first one who accepts it, will be the accepted offer. So is that not the best practice?
First one. It's like a marathon. He who breaks
Yeah.
the tape wins. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. So then you have to read your buyer's mind and respond for them on the spot. The first person with the deposit check doesn't get the prize. I remember, back in the market of 2006, people were writing offers on the hoods of the car. And there were, I remember one scenario, there were cars all over the neighborhood like you're seeing now with multiple offers. And everybody was writing offers on the car and running up to me at the front door as the listing agent saying, here's the deposit, like the first one's gonna get it. If there's no first season real estate. So in that situation, Christina, you're right. We have a situation where somebody's countering to all. So all I can say is don't do that.
Okay.
And ask that co-broke. It's one of those objection handling techniques. Okay, thank you for letting me know, Mr. Listing Agent. I appreciate that. So help me out. I'm confused. How is the seller going to handle it if everyone accepts their counter offer? How does that work? Just so I can properly advise my buyer client. Now, if they ever say the first one to get it is just insane because it could be the least qualified out of all of them, then they're truly only making a decision based on price. And that is not the way to make a decision based solely on price. By the way, there are many offers that come together in a multiple offer situation that it's not the highest price, and the co-broke gets upset afterwards because they use an escalation clause and well, my offer was higher. Why did your seller? You just lost your seller money. No, the seller decided that there was a better qualified buyer. So I can't speak for other co-brokes, and how they handle it. But to me, if you're making a counter offer to a client, then you're willing to stand behind that counter offer when they accept, and that means you cannot provide counteroffers to multiple parties. You can do it consecutively, line them up and say, I like this one first, let's counter to them. If they don't do it, let's counter to the next one. If they don't do it, counter to the next one. And don't even tell the others that you're doing it. No reason to tell the others what the seller is doing behind the scenes and making a decision that's best for themselves. And we'll hit on multiple offers and how to word them. You know, but your sellers should not be countering to multiple parties, because if it's done on your advice, their attorney will have a field day with that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for
Or ask their attorney to get involved, you know, to advise, get a conference call with their attorney.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. No, I appreciate it. Tara.
Okay, so at that point, wouldn't you go back to everyone and say your highest and best?
You can, yes, you absolutely can. So you know, let's hit on that. So, you know, highest and best offer, we also want to watch the language of highest and best, because many of the buyers were already at their highest, and they might get insulted if you ask them for their highest and best because they've already given it. In many cases, we inform people that there are multiple offers on the table if your seller allows you to. Make sure you have the seller's permission. It's on the listing agreement. The seller needs to give you permission to inform other parties whether or not there is an offer on the table, another offer on the table. It's not carte blanche where you just tell everybody, I got another offer. You know, immediately we think as an agent, well, that'll create some excitement, maybe bidding environment, get them up, you know, rally them, rah, rah, rah. No, you know, explaining that there are multiple offers on a property could jeopardize the sale. And I'll get back to that. For the purposes of your point, Tara, multiple offer situation, there's a form in the site, Instanet, or whatever program you're using. It's called multiple offer form. Now, it does ask for their highest and best, but if you say those words highest and best and the buyers have already given their highest and best, they're going to be like, you know, I mean, that's my best. What more do you want from me? I'm out. So just inform all parties, listen, there are multiple offers. The seller's giving a certain deadline, it's on the form, for all parties to bring in their final offer, as opposed to highest and best, their final offer for the seller to make a decision. So you're right in everything that you're saying, Tara. Clear the field, the confusion. Make sure that everyone knows they're competing. Ask everyone for their final offer by a certain time. Make sense? So I like what you're saying. The only point I wanted to mention, Tara, to that is that not every seller wants you to inform everybody that there are multiple offers. So I wanted to make sure that I clarified that for the purposes of the group. You agree?
Makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
So, and remember, it's in your seller's, in your listing agreement, whether or not you have the right to discuss multiple offers. Now, there are some that don't use that form, okay? But please look at the form if you've never used it, because there are folks that say, well, I know that I've informed everybody. Everybody knows that there are multiple offers. It's important that, see, I'll give you the example. You have one offer that comes in and it's the only offer. You have a call from your second buyer and they're saying, you know, my buyer wants to make an offer. And you say, well, I need you to know there's an offer on the table. Well, that buyer comes in knowing they're competing. The first buyer came in not knowing they were competing. So it gives them a disadvantage, that first buyer, because they weren't competing at the time. They might have come in with a more aggressive offer had they known they were competing, like the benefit of the second offer. So what Tara mentioned with going back and, you know, explaining multiple offers, asking for final offer, clears the playing field. Bigger than that, that form is required to be signed by the buyer, not the co-broke. I'm not negative about co-brokes. We love co-brokes in this industry. We all work together. What I'm negative on is misinformed co-brokes that just weren't coached to proper communication. And I'm not being politically correct when I say that, because that's the unfortunate reality. None of us knew what we were doing until we learned how to do it. And ultimately, if that co-broke does not explain a multiple offer situation or highest and best to their buyer client properly, when they don't get the house, whose fault is it? When they don't get a counter offer, whose fault is it? It's yours as the listing agent, because that co-broke didn't explain it properly, may have told them what to offer. Never tell a buyer what to offer, especially price. If they don't get the house, it's your fault. And ultimately, they have to save face. So I can't believe listing agent didn't tell me what was going on. Well, this form requires their buyer to sign it. There's no mistaking that you informed everybody of the situation. Make sense? So use that form whenever possible. It completely levels the playing field. Also give people enough time to respond. You know, sometimes buyers want to make an offer. They need to talk to their lender because they want to go higher in their offer than what they had expected. You know, so at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, don't give everybody a 5 p.m. deadline. They might be at work. They might not be able to talk to their lender. You know, so you know, give everybody till the following day at noon. Some people want to sleep on it. You know, so, you know, it's fair to your seller, unless there's somebody who's giving a deadline and you're afraid to lose it. You know, let the seller decide how they want to perform on that timeline. So I see, you know, Tara, I'm going to let you expand on yours, and then Lisa, I see your hand raised. Tara?
Yeah, so can you explain that multiple offer form?
Yeah. So the form itself, it basically informs all parties, and literally it's called multiple offer, you know, in the system in Instinet. And it just basically says that the buyer is made aware that the seller has received multiple offers on the property. The seller is asking for everyone's final offer no later than blank, and you put in the date by which the seller, and through your consulting, the deadline for all offers. Now everybody comes in with their final offer, to use the language. Again, I'm not avoiding it, I'm just trying to be clear on it. The highest and best, but again, highest isn't always best. So the final offer by tomorrow at noon. So now everybody has till tomorrow at noon. People aren't scrambling, going all over the place, calling you, what are you doing? You know, no co-broke listing agent handles a multiple offer the same. It's up to you to understand. If you're on the buyer side, ask them how they're going to handle it. Make them tell you, hey, just so I understand you have multiple offers. How are you going to be handling this with your seller? What will you be advising your seller? Will you be setting a deadline for all offers? How much time do I have? You know, if a co-broke just says, hey, I've got another offer on the table, you know, let me know what your buyer is going to do. Well, okay, do I have time? What does that mean? So the multiple offered form informs all parties, gives everyone the same deadline, puts everyone on a level playing field.
Okay,
Make
great.
sense?
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. Use it all the time. It's not a detriment, it's a communication tool. Okay, cool. Lisa.
I think you just answered a bunch of my questions, but what point, I guess, when you get all these offers, is the point you submit them, you email the co-brokes all this form, correct?
I would do it the second you get the second offer.
Okay, because my last, we had 4 offers, and I didn't know of this form, and I did it verbally, and I gave them a time to submit everybody.
Yeah. And you probably did it right, Lisa, to your credit, you know, because you were very informative. The only missing link is whether or not they explained it properly to their buyer.
Okay.
So then the buyer talks to their family. We lost out on a house. It was listed with HomeSmart, and, you know, the listing agent didn't give us a chance to counter, and the listing agent didn't do this, and it has nothing to do with you because the co-broke just didn't explain it properly. The form makes the buyer sign it and make sure that they're truly informed.
Okay, so the form is really basically to cover your butt.
Oh yes, cover your assets, right, exactly. Yep. So the form, yes, it just informs all parties, sets a deadline. So when you have 2 offers, you know, you can use it. Now, I'm not saying you have to use it all the time. I just suggest it, you know, because then there's no question on anybody's part how long they have and, you know, what they have. Now, it also, by the way, it also allows time for other offers to come in. You don't have to redisclose that there are multiple offers because you already told them. Multiple offers could be 2, it could be 20.
Yeah.
Who cares how many are on the property? Like, you know, don't keep asking the listing agent, you know, hey, did you get other offers? Did you get other offers? I know you said 3. How many are there? You know, it doesn't matter. There's still multiple. So you still want to compete. You know, the buyer needs to come in with their final offer, you know. And by the way, as a co-broke buyer, you know, then use the form as well if you want to, even if they didn't give it to you, so that your buyer truly understands that form clearly states to a buyer they have 1 shot at it. Give it your best shot. Make sense? Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. Marion.
Okay, so I was in that current situation and I had 7 offers.
I wasn't talking about you, Marion.
I know, but thank you for helping me, Dean. So I just printed the form and I have it. I never have used it in my profession before.
Yep.
So I'm the one that initiates this to the other agents that have given the offers from their buyers.
Yes, listing agent. Yep.
When I finally get this, I just want to make sure, because when I rejected other ones or told them that the seller picked another person, a lot of people came back to me and said I had an escalation clause. How come I didn't win? And,
Yes.
and my seller went with, well, it was over asking price, but he actually went with a lower price.
Yes.
But higher than what we were asking for.
Yeah.
And his main concern was always about the closing costs. He did not want to do the closing costs, and just in case the house didn't appraise properly, he didn't want to have to accept that offer and then give them the closing costs towards it. So
Right.
he went with the one that didn't have a closing cost. So I didn't know how to explain to the other agents about the escalation clause. Like, why were they asking me that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to make sure that our sellers understand that it's not about the closing cost, because it's many buyers need closing costs. It's about that net price. Now, if it was inflated to include the closing cost credit, I can see where the seller had that concern, and I remember our conversation.
Yes.
Ultimately, the seller didn't want it not to appraise just because the buyer was rolling in costs on top of their price. And it was a valid concern. But to your question, the best way to respond to a co-broke, what do you mean? I had an escalation clause. The escalation clause was $50,000 over list price. How could I not get this offer? The best way is to lead into it. Again, acknowledge the concern. Mr. Co-broke, I can understand how you feel. When I consulted with the seller made a decision based on all contingencies of each offer and chose the offer that they felt best met their needs based on all contingencies.
Okay,
Don't say, and price wasn't one of them. Okay?
right.
Don't get into that. It's not about their price. Now, I guess you could say, it's not out of the norm to say, price wasn't as important as terms. But we need to know that. Again, the highest price is not always the winner. But you don't want to imply to a co-broke why the seller chose the other. Like saying, well, another offer had a 45-day closing date, and the seller, needed the extra 2 weeks. Yours was a 30-day closing date. Don't get into that, because the co-broke's going to say, well, what do you mean? Why didn't they just counter? If they liked our terms, why didn't they just counter? Well, you had your chance to make your offer.
Right.
You should have said 30 days negotiable. You had your chance to give your final offer. Your buyer had the final chance to give their final offer. If that was a flexible date, you should have told me. But you can avoid that dialogue by not discussing it. I always talk in terms of examples, and in most cases, the examples are current. I spoke with one of our agents recently, about a week or so ago, and they posted on the sale, my seller got a cash offer, and we're so excited, sold in 2 days. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Like, take cash out. Why are you telling the world that these people had this cash? And they immediately were like, oh my God, I didn't think of that. Like, that's nobody's business how this buyer is accepting this property. And it was an innocent thing, because we're all excited, like, I did a great job for my seller. I got them their price with these terms, but that's confidential information. We don't want that buyer's friends and family to see what their financial status is. Make sense? So even in a conversation or a text or an email communication, seller went with a cash offer. No, terms should not be discussed. By the way, if there's an offer subject to the buyer selling their house, you don't say to a co-broke, well, I have an offer on the table, but it's a Hubbard. so bring me an offer. You know, like, no, that's a contingency. You don't discuss any contingencies. The seller makes decisions based on the face value of all those contingencies. Make sense?
Makes sense. I
Great.
wish you were with me at that time.
We're ordering little earpieces so that you can just tune in and I can be there at all times.
Sounds like, I like that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, definitely. Rex.
Okay, you got me now?
I hear you.
Okay. So I just wanted to add something. So in this crazy market we're in right now, and we're running into problems that we don't normally deal with every day, one of the things that I found really helpful that calms the buyers, and you can actually kind of reverse it and use some of this with the seller as well, but if you explain net to your buyers, it kind of takes some of the anxiety out of it if they think they're either not going to win the bid or they didn't win the bid. Net and qualifications. Once they understand this, you know, just having an escalator, because you know, everybody wants to put an escalator clause in now. Once you understand whatever your asks are, whatever the contingencies are, your net is really, as far as price goes, the more clear clarification, you know, thing for them.
Right.
And also, maybe somebody's more qualified. They have a bigger down payment. They have a different kind of loan. You know, so, and you don't, like you say, you don't have to discuss the details of somebody else's offer with them, but once they understand that, the buyers, I take some of the anxiety out of the buyer, I think.
Yes. And to that point, it all comes down to the communication of it, doesn't it? You know, if you properly explained all of the details and what it means to other people and themselves, then ultimately everybody's more informed and can make the right decisions. So thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. I agree completely.
Yeah. And the more they understand, the more less likely they are to say, this guy's not getting it done. He doesn't, you know, this is just too much of a rat race for me dealing with this agent. You know, the more they understand, the more comfortable they are with their situation. So,
totally agree. Awesome. Thanks. So, so I want to make sure that I'm taking advantage of all of our time. You know, it's a ton of great information and it's timely topics that we're dealing with. You know, I'm looking at the time and I normally wanted to take a break in between. With your permission, I'm just going to continue along. Is that okay? So yes, everybody, great. So if you need to just send a text, Maria, I do see your hand. If you do need to send a text or an email or what have you, but got a lot of content that I want to hit on, but much of what we've talked about already is so timely that I didn't want to lose sight of it. So Maria, go ahead.
I have a question. Let's say your offer was accepted and I have the buyer and the seller already did the septic test, the well test, and the home inspection. Now,
the seller
my buyer
already
is going to
did
do a home inspection.
So,
But regarding
sorry.
the septic
Maria?
and the well, do we do a test?
Maria, I'm just going to ask you to repeat because you faded out on my end. So the seller already did those other tests?
The seller did, yes.
Okay. So, the question is, should the buyer do those tests?
Correct.
Okay. Well, and you know, the short answer is yes.
Okay.
You know, because the buyer should always hire the professionals that make them feel comfortable in making a decision.
Okay.
However, there are times that if the seller shares the results of those inspections and the buyer feels comfortable speaking with those professionals and feels confident based on what's been explained, then the buyer can choose not to do those inspections. So, but I want to make sure that you hear the chain of communication. So we would never, and I know you would never, we would never advise a buyer not to do an inspection because they have an inspection report from somebody else. But we can advise that buyer to do their due diligence based on the reports that are shared with them to make the necessary inquiries to confirm whether or not they'd like to do their own.
Okay.
Follow me? Because if you notice, it all comes back to the client. If you say, hey, we got these inspection reports, we don't need to inspect, these are great. The buyer, after they move in, they don't have a flush, they're calling you because of that great inspection report that you told them that they should feel comfortable with. Make sense?
Yep.
Yep. So always bring it back to their decision, their decision, their decision. Okay. And just coach them through it. You know, as a buyer, you have the right to do your own inspections. You don't have to trust these. However, these might be trustworthy, contractors, and it'd be worth talking to them. If you could save the money and you feel confident with their experience, then great. But it's not about saving money. Home inspections are the best investment you will make in your transaction, Mr. Buyer. And whether you want to do your own or you want to trust these, I want to make sure you have all the information you need in order to make that decision for yourself and your family.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Great, thanks. So ultimately, when we look, there are a number of contingencies we're going to deal with. There are a lot of terms in each contract we're going to deal with, and we need to understand how to navigate all of them. There are 4 major points in each sales agreement that we navigate. We've got price, we've got closing date, we've got financing, as we mentioned, and we've got the inspection. So ultimately, start with the price. Please make sure your clients are determining the price. When you're working with a buyer or for a buyer, they should be determining what to offer. Do not ever say to a buyer, I think you should start here and let's see what the seller says. By the way, if your buyer wants to offer more than you think they should, you can give them your input, but don't change their mind intentionally. If the buyer says, hey, listen, what are your thoughts? You think I should start at, they're asking $250. Should I start at like $240? Well, I'll tell you, quite honestly, there are no other offers on the table. So you may want to try $230, see what they say. Well, so the buyer decides to offer $230, another offer comes in at $240, the other offer gets it. Whose fault? Yours. Okay, so don't advise them. Now, in that same scenario, well, Mr. Buyer, you could start at the $240. If that's how much you feel it's worth to you, let's look at the value range. Ultimately, there are different strategies you can take. You can offer a certain amount to see what the seller comes back with. You can go right in with the most you're willing to pay. Whatever it is that you're more comfortable with. But ultimately, I can confirm for you, based on these recent sales, that that home is worth in the value range of $230 to $260. So, if that's what you're comfortable offering, let's move forward. Okay? Bring it right back to them. We have to make sure that sellers are not insulted by low offers. I tell my sellers all the time, now in this market, we might not have that issue because of the multiple offers and the low inventory. Everybody's offering over asking price, okay? But there are some times that a buyer will offer less than what the seller thinks is reasonable, right? So I tell my sellers all the time, don't be insulted by a low offer. Be insulted by somebody who came to look and didn't make one. All right, hear those words, help them rationalize, because sellers get insulted, don't they? So Mr. Seller, don't be insulted by a low offer, be insulted by somebody who came and didn't make an offer. This offer, if it's your only offer, is higher than every other offer we have, because it's your only offer. So if you don't feel that it's enough for what you would hope to receive for your property, then we can make a counter offer, because we have 3 choices with every offer, don't we? We can accept, and that would be great. Your home is sold. We can reject, and that won't be so great because you're not accomplishing your goal. Or we can counter, but know that a counter offer is a rejection of an offer, and we need to know that it comes with certain outcome opportunities. How would you like to proceed? Okay, just help them talk through it within themselves. They should not be insulted by any offer. Okay, again, in today's market, that's what we're dealing with, is multiple offers often. I know you guys are, you're struggling with it. I've lived it, but there are other markets where any offer is just a blessing. When I was in the business, started in the business, 13,000 single family homes on the market, I was begging co-brokes just to show my listings just so I could say I did. Relationships were more important than ever. It's like, if you're out with your buyers, can you just show my house? Even if it's not what they're looking for, I just want to tell my seller I had a showing, And sometimes, quite frankly, it resulted in a sale because buyers aren't liars. They just don't know what they want. Okay, and sometimes they need to see what it is, else that's out there to say, you know what, hey, this is kind of nice. Okay, we've got the closing date. We talked about price. We've got the closing date. When it comes to closing date, please don't, I already mentioned this, please don't tell them when they should close. Consult with them. If your buyer is flexible on closing date, identify that in your offer so that the seller can take that under advisement. Okay, so always ask, by the way, with curiosity, when they would like to close. There are some buyers who can't close in 30 days. There are some sellers who can't close in 30 days. They might, when you look at a calendar and you're setting a closing date on your offer or a counter offer with your seller, look at a calendar with them. So I've seen many buyers set a closing date on an offer and the closing date fell within a week that they're out of town on vacation. So it was never even an opportunity because they're not even in town. So don't just throw an arbitrary date, 30 days, 45 days. By the way, in today's market, I recommend 45 days. Okay, 30 days is great, but there's so much to accomplish and so many restrictions we've got to navigate in the world today that you're running around in circles. Your seller is not, the seller, if you're working with the buyer, is not going to move overnight, and they're not going to start packing until all the contingencies have been met. So don't set yourself up for a failure with an extension that's requested and your buyer gave their notice on their apartment already and now people need more time. Okay, so we need to be realistic with the time that's there. We can always close early if all parties agree. The key is people agreeing to it. And in many respects, the closing date is determined by the financing, the type of financing the buyer is doing. So I urge you as a listing agent, when you're about to accept an offer, call the loan officer and say, you know, hey, listen, I'm not looking for confidential information on this buyer. I just want to confirm your pre-approval letter, but I also want to ask you, they're asking for a 30-day closing. Is that realistic for the financing that the buyer is going in? 9 times out of 10, that loan offer is going to say, oh my God, they said 30 days. Like, this buyer can't do this. We need to do this. We need this. 45 days would be better. You know, so, you know, get confirmation that they can perform, because now you're setting expectations from everyone. Make sense? Okay. And if there are delays, make sure that you're informing everybody of the delays. All right. Financing. Critical that you understand financing. Critical you remember, depending on the side of the transaction that you're on, that you're clarifying the details. Do not arbitrarily change the details of a financing clause from offer to sales agreement. Meaning, if you're representing the buyer, we mentioned earlier, set yourself up with an interest rate cap. Christina, I see your hand, so bear with me. So you know, set yourself up with an interest rate cap to protect the buyer should the rates go up overnight. Now, it has to be a reasonable cap if they're not about to lock in yet. And you know, make sure, so if the rate is 3.5 that the buyer is qualified on, maybe you put 4.25 or something. You know, there has to be some fluidity there, but don't just arbitrarily have no, you know, many co-brokers believe in the term prevailing or current for an interest rate, and that does not protect the buyer. Now, by the way, if you represent the seller, that's a beautiful thing because the buyer is on the hook. It all depends who you represent, doesn't it? Okay. So I'm not sure which topic, but Christina, I'm going to throw, Christina, go ahead. Christina, can you hear me?
Yep, just forewarning, I do have a toddler in and out.
No worries.
Busy. So I find I'm struggling lately with trying to have these conversations with when I'm representing a buyer and the listing agent is like adamant on, you know, mortgage contingency date in 3 weeks, you know, putting prevailing in for interest rate. And it's, you know, with the way the market is right now, I just feel like I'm pinched between a rock and a hard place, and I'm just trying to get my buyer in a legally binding agreement with the seller, instead of, you know, possibly preventing that because we're getting held up on these, you know, details that I do feel are very important. I'm just wondering if you have like any better ways to really handle that, because I see some listing agents, I'm sure you know exactly where I'm getting.
No, absolutely. So and I recognize that that's happening. So, you know, I talk in terms of perfect world. What we need to realize is that there are some agents, excuse me, sellers agents that do not want to see a capped interest rate in the financing. I hope they're asking their seller to back them on that decision, because again, it all comes back to the client. But if they advise their seller that they should not allow a capped interest rate, then it should say prevailing or current, then that is a counter offer from the seller for your buyer's offer, because any change in any terms is a counter offer. Okay. Now, I've even heard listing agent co-broke say, well, it's my office policy that we only allow prevailing on
My
that line.
favorite, my absolute favorite.
Yep, and I think you and I dealt with this directly.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact remains is that there's no such thing as an office policy for a contingency in a sale with a buyer and seller. There is no office policy that supersedes what the clients should be saying. Now, they can be advising their seller clients to do this, and it becomes a counter from the seller. So it's semantics. But don't ever say out loud, it's my policy to delay an appraisal. It's my policy to have prevailing in there. It's my policy. This is what we do for all of our sellers. So, there's no across the board in negotiations. There's no such thing. You can consult and you can have a belief and an advisement for your client, but don't tell them what they're going to do. So to your question, how do we handle it? If that seller is being advised, whether it's the agent's opinion or not, if the seller says, I'm not comfortable with a cap in that financing, then you need to speak with your buyer client, explain to them the ramifications of not having a capped interest rate in that contingency, and ask them what terms they are comfortable moving forward with, if any. It may be just a matter of them locking into an interest rate right there, and make sure that the interest rate lock is enough time to cover the closing date. Whatever that is, let the buyer decide. Now, we may have a strong, adamant feeling against not having it, and you can advise your buyer of that. Quite frankly, I agree. But at the end of the day, the buyer has to decide how they want to move forward. We're not going to do a tug of war. We're not going to say, this and that's not fair. Nothing's fair in negotiation, but both parties have to agree to what they're comfortable with in moving forward. So I don't like it, but and I don't like it changing after the fact. You present an offer, everything's agreed upon, sales agreement draft comes back with a prevailing in that line. Yeah. Not acceptable. So you just say to the co-broke, okay, so your seller's making a counter offer at this time? Well, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? Well, you changed the term. I need to now go back to my buyer and present this counter offer. So just talk through it. I'm not going to say it's easy. Again, I love broker to broker conversations. So, pull me in when you need it.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, just consult with the buyer and let the buyer decide whether or not to move forward. You may not ever change it.
Okay. And regarding the mortgage contingency, Dee, like when they, have pushback on that, what is the full ramification if, we leave it to satisfy, the seller preference on that and the buyer's okay with it, and let's say they do need to file that extension, are there any ways that a seller at that time could say no to the request for the extension and then kick the buyer out by any means?
The seller can absolutely say no to any extension request. Absolutely. As long as you've requested, the way the financing contingency reads, as long as you've requested that extension within the timeline, then the buyer's deposit is safe, even if the seller doesn't agree to an extension. I know it's not about the deposit, it's about them buying the house, but at least the deposit is safe. And, and ultimately the seller doesn't have to agree. However, the buyer doesn't have to give them a release either. If the buyer is coming right upon the time upon which they're going to have their commitment, then the buyer doesn't have to sign a release if they feel confident in moving forward, just that the seller didn't agree to an extension. And we would need to make sure that we're looking at legal advice as to how to move forward from there. It's not automatically null and void if the seller says no.
Okay. So bring in the attorneys at that time?
Case by case, bring it to me and let's look at it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Great info. Tara?
Okay, so you brought up a really good point, because I've always written, that's what I was taught, 10 years ago, to write prevailing.
I know. We're here to help people out of old bad habits.
So how do you guess?
What did you always do? Finish your statement for the group.
Well, no, so I would always write prevailing, and I never
For your buyers?
Yes.
Okay.
So you know, and there was never ever an issue. So how do you know what interest rate to choose or to recommend to the buyer?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and fortunately you haven't had an issue, and sometimes it doesn't matter, to be honest with you. Let's be honest, the rates are not going to jump up 1%, 2% overnight, are they? Well, you know what? They did once.
Right.
They did once, 2.5 months ago, jumped up 1% overnight and then dropped back down. Who saw that coming? Some of you didn't even see it happening because you weren't affected by it at that moment, but it happened. And you know, the key is that if you put prevailing and they qualify for that higher rate and the rate jumps up, they're bound to buy that house. So if they're qualified at 3%, they're comfortable with the payment at 3%, the rate jumps up to 4%, and they're still qualified to pay 4%, whether they like that payment or not, they're bound to that agreement. So how do we advise them? I would just do a reasonable amount of variation. I kind of do 0.5%, but again, I consult with a buyer and say, here's what I recommend, but it's your decision. You know, as long as they're comfortable with the payment, if it bounced up 0.5%, then you're good. You can do a full 1%. You're trying to make the seller feel comfortable that the buyer is not looking for an out, or they're not a marginal buyer. If a buyer can't afford it, if the payment goes up $10, then the seller needs to know it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And the short answer is talk to the loan officer. What rate
Okay.
do you suggest I put in as a cap rate based on where the buyer's comfort level is?
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Marion?
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute.
Okay. These
So
questions help everyone, so I appreciate it.
yes, so if I am the listing agent and an agent gives me a purchase and sale agreement saying prevailing, that's okay for me. But you're talking prevailing is if that's my buyer.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Thank you. It all depends on who you're representing. You know,
Okay.
if you have a co-broke buyer agent that gives you an offer with prevailing, then, you know, that's unfortunate for them, you know, that they didn't properly advise. And we represent the seller, so we're going to allow them to put that in there. You bet.
Okay, it's for the buyer that's where I should be protecting my buyer.
Absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Tara, did you raise your hand again? Tara? Or did it just?
No, I didn't raise my hand again. Sorry.
All right, no problem. Well, you did, but you didn't. Right, exactly. I lowered your hand for you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
All
Text that.
right, cool. So I want to actually continue on that financing clause. So, you know, interest rate, we got that covered. The biggest thing that people don't realize or the confusion and the debate that we constantly get, that I'm constantly navigating, and I'm glad to continue to do so, is whether or not we should be sharing a commitment letter with the listing agent. Okay, you need to know our sales agreements do not clarify that a buyer is required to share a commitment letter with the seller. You need to know that the contingency says that if the buyer has given a commitment letter to the seller, whether it's to the agent or the seller, it's the same thing, that the buyer is acknowledging satisfaction with that contingency, which means they're waiving their financing contingency. It says that if the buyer shares a commitment letter with the seller, that they are deeming this contingency satisfied. Nowhere in it does it say buyer must share commitment letter with seller. So I need you to understand, by the way, that's how the law came out. It doesn't mean that's how it went in, okay? So, you know, and we can dissect that on each individual agreement, as in many cases in states that don't have standardized agreements, the attorney is drafting it. So you want to watch that depending on the state that you're doing your business in. But speaking for the Rhode Island sales agreement, it clearly states that if that date passes, then the buyer is deeming satisfied. It says if the buyer shares a commitment letter, the buyer is deeming it satisfied. That's it. So if your buyer is not satisfied with a commitment letter that they receive, all the conditions matter. If it says subject to buyer closing on their house, they haven't closed on their house yet, it matters, okay? So ultimately, you know, if the buyer is not satisfied with all conditions and they're not willing to waive the financing contingency in full, they need to request an extension of that clause. Make sense? All right. Tara, go ahead.
So quick question. I guess I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that you shouldn't share the commitment letter, because I would assume if I, but if, okay, I'm afraid that there's going to be pushback on that, because the seller's going to want to know that this person definitely got the commitment letter.
Totally understand. So I'm going to talk to you from a legal perspective on the Rhode Island agreement. If the buyer does not extend the financing contingency, the seller needs to feel confident that they have the approval they need. So that's how they know they got their commitment letter. That's how it's legally written. I totally understand, because as a listing agent, I'll get any commitment letter anytime I can, because I also want to know what the conditions are. Just because the buyer is waiving the commitment doesn't mean my seller should start packing. But I can only speak to what the contract says. That commitment letter is a confidential document. How many of you want to share a commitment letter that says buyer to obtain documentation of bankruptcy sign-off that occurred after the divorce settlement, after they, you know, like, these are all confidential details. You're sharing that with the listing agent or the seller. You know, now, by the way, I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna say, if your buyer, if the listing agent wants it and your buyer gives you permission to share it, then share it. Send an email to your buyer and say, seller's really asking for this. They just want to confirm that, you know, what the details are and that we have commitment. Are you comfortable with me sharing your commitment letter? Yes, no problem. Great, send it. I'm not saying you need to hold it captive. I'm saying that if the buyer doesn't want it shared, you can't share it. It's a confidential document.
I understand it's legal. I'm just afraid of pushback, especially in this market, because the seller's going to want to make sure that this person can, you know, the buyer can definitely buy it.
Totally understand. So again, just ask your buyer, hey, listen, we're going to get pushback on this. We got the commitment. It'd be worth it for us to share this so the seller's comfortable, so everybody moves forward to a successful closing. Again, with their permission, you can share it. I'm not saying don't share it. I'm saying you don't have to.
Right, but I'm saying, what if the buyer says, no, I don't want it shared?
Then you can't. And the seller says, well, I want to know. Well, you don't need to know. Why? Because the contingency date passed. The buyer didn't ask for an extension. The buyer didn't give a commitment because they don't have to. We'll see you at the closing. Thank you for your concerns.
Okay, that sounds good.
You know, by the way, it's not as easy as that. And especially, I know that certain market sectors will determine certain personalities in the co-broke. And I understand what we're all up against. I'm not saying it's easy, but if the buyer doesn't want it shared because you're airing all their dirty laundry, don't share it. Be very careful. The contract does not obligate you to sharing it. Okay?
Thank you.
Now, I want to be very mindful. We've got a lot of great questions, but I also have a lot of stuff I want to hit on. So I'm going to go. Tara, you good on yours? Tara, you're good? All right. Angela, go ahead. Hi, Angela.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly mention, I have a background from the financial side, and when we were providing commitments, we had a generic version as well that didn't list out all the details. I'm not sure what other lenders do, so that is an option too. You can reach out to that lender and ask for the generic one that just says, you know, they received their commitment without the details. So if you're feeling like you're being challenged from the other side, that might be a nice option, so that you don't have to have those difficult discussions and you've still, you know, met the needs of both.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that.
You.
You know, if you can get a copy of that or something, you know, a letter on letterhead, you know, from the lender that will do away with sharing the private details. Angela, thank you so much. That's an awesome point. Marion, did you have a quick question?
Yes. When you say don't share, can they share to the listing agent at least?
Sharing to the listing agent is sharing to the seller. That's the party that represents the seller. Same thing. So when I say share with the seller, anybody that works for the seller and represents the seller, if they have it, they're obligated by law to share it with their client.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, no, great clarification. Thanks. Okay, so the financing is a big one. The timelines, that's a constant, struggle that we see, So, the other contingency of inspection of the contract is inspections, The bottom line is what we need to understand with inspections is that you have a certain period of time, okay? In Rhode Island, it's 10 business days, excluding weekends and holidays, to accomplish everything. And the only thing I want you to understand with this, or the biggest thing I want you to understand, is you have 10 days to accomplish everything, not 10 business days to do inspections. The 10 business days in the inspection clause, and this is the one clause that's time is of the essence. In other states, most clauses are time is of the essence. And that means time is of the essence doesn't mean everybody needs to hurry along because we all want to get it done. Time is of the essence means it's a drop dead date. When the date passes, everything's it's either null and void or we're moving on. It is what it is. So you have 10 business days to conduct inspections, further evaluate any issues, make any requests of the seller, and come to agreement with the seller on all repairs with a repair addendum if that applies. So that's a lot to accomplish in 10 business days, especially based on how busy everybody is these days. So be mindful. You can request an extension of time. You can even negotiate an extension of time up front at the time of the offer. If you know that the property has a well, a septic, it's got a radon system for water, it's got a swimming pool that needs to be inspected, it's got, all this stuff, like talk about it up front. You're not going to get all of these professionals in within that time frame. It comes down to setting expectations. But it's important that you realize that all of those details need to be settled and put into a repair addendum. Now we have two. We have a repair request form and we have a repair addendum. The repair request form asks the seller for the items, but also gives the seller time to respond to those requests, okay, which sometimes can go beyond the inspection clause. The repair addendum is an after-the-fact form that people sign together once they've agreed on all of the details. Now, the repair request form, we need to be careful because the repair request form says, if the seller doesn't agree to everything on the included list, that the agreement is null and void. Don't use that form hastily because you don't want the seller to find a loophole to withdraw from the agreement if they have backup offers because the seller didn't like your request. So in the spirit of conversation, discuss the issues and work to get to a repair agreement. But at the end, if you hit the end of your timeline, make sure that you've covered the buyer, that their request, you don't want to be on the 10th day waiting at 11:30 p.m. because nobody signed a repair addendum and you didn't cover your buyer for the deposit. You may need to use the repair request form in the 11th hour to cover the buyer's deposit. Okay, Lisa? Lisa?
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Yes. So recently I've received a request, but not on, well, one person co-broke for the buyer side. We requested it on a addendum instead of a request. Then another situation I had, I just went forward with it. I didn't really address it. But then the last situation that I just came across, the co-broke actually made up her own form and label it a repair addendum. And I questioned her on it. I said, why isn't it submitted on a repair request? That's the way it's supposed to be done. I didn't say that in so many words, but. Right. And she said, well, because the boxes on there are too small to fit all of the requests that we had.
Yeah, it's inconvenient, right?
The paper.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, here's the thing. If, by the way, we didn't always have a repair request form. We always went right to a repair addendum, and it basically says that parties have agreed, but we haven't even discussed it. If the parties are agreeing to it, if you've discussed it verbally and parties have agreed, hey, let's write it up on an agreement, the repair request form is there to protect the buyer's deposit in the end if the seller hasn't responded properly or the buyer wants out if they don't agree to everything. So, if you talk through things, if a co-broke, if you sent over the request form, it all automatically protected your buyer's deposit. If they say, hey, put it on a repair addendum format, okay, no problem. So what you're telling me is that the sellers agreed to everything? Well, no, I just want it in this format. Well, this is the format the buyer chose based on the forms that we have available to them. So, if the seller's going to agree, I'll be glad to go right to an agreement. I'm excited to hear that you want to do an agreement, Mr. Colebrook. So, see how I blame my buyer again?
Yeah.
The buyer wanted to use this form. So, we're taking the necessary steps. But if you agree that with all of these things are good, let's go right to an agreement. That's great. Do you want to call your seller and call me back?
Right.
Okay. So, it's, but you're not using the improper form just because they want to use the other form.
All right.
They may not be familiar with your form. So, it's okay to have that discussion.
I told them though that, we're not going to sign the form because we haven't even decided what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. They sent it over as an addendum she put our signatures on there too, requesting. And I said, no, we're not going to sign because we would agree to all this if we signed it.
So are you on the seller side?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, if they send you over a repair agreement, you're not going to sign it until the seller agrees, but some people use it as a form of communication, as a request. I wouldn't worry so much about that. You can kind of look at it and say, oh, that's funny, they're assuming we're agreeing, but they use it as a communication tool. It's kind of like making an offer on a sales agreement. You set an offer on a purchase and sales agreement, hoping the seller's just going to sign it and agree. We know they probably won't. But same thing with a repair addendum. I wouldn't get hung up on it. It's just their way of communicating. In case the seller does agree, they have a form that they can just sign and it's all put to bed.
Right.
Yep. On the buyer side, it's more important to make sure that it says what you need it to say.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay, great, thanks. So, further along with that, it's important that we realize that, whether or not, whatever that resolve is, whatever the repair is, it needs to be put in writing. If you're trying to negotiate a credit for repairs, you need to know that very few lenders allow credits. And you need to check with the lender if you're just trying to do a monetary concession between the parties. So be careful of that and watch for that, to make sure that the lender agrees. Do not allow your parties to provide each other a check under the table at closing. And I say under the table, it doesn't matter whether it's under the car, whether it's under the table, or whether it's in somebody's briefcase on the counter. It's illegal. Your parties are signing paperwork at closing that says there are no side deals between the parties. Everything that's agreed upon is part of this closing statement. Anything outside of that, other than maybe an oil adjustment or something like that. But if there's a repair, you can work to see if the bank will allow a credit for that. Some repairs they'll want repaired before closing, before they'll put financing behind it. There are some times, depending on the amount, on the lower amount items, you can have a contractor give a price for a repair, have the invoice submitted at closing so that the payment is taken from the seller's proceeds, and the buyer now has a check to pay that contractor. But it has to be a contractor. Now I'm saying $400, $500. I'm not saying 20 grand. Buyer wants to remodel the kitchen. Let's submit an invoice for a new kitchen to a contractor and have the seller pay at closing. It doesn't work that way. I'm talking everyday repairs that the seller doesn't want to repair before closing, or may not have the time to repair before closing, but you have a price to base it on. The attorney will pay any invoices that are submitted at closing, but all parties are aware of it. Make sense? Okay, so make sure that you're covering that. Nicole?
Okay, quick question.
Sure.
Termite plan that extend after the closing date. So like my clients have pest control treatment that they pay quarterly, so they've paid until October, but they're closing in May. So they were planning to just like give a gift to the buyer and just pay, not necessarily cancel the plan on closing date.
Okay.
So is that part of an agreement that should be on the closing documents?
So the seller's paying it in advance?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if they pay it to the company in advance,
Yep.
that's okay. It really comes down to credits between buyer and seller. So
Alright.
if the seller has a service agreement and says, hey, I'm going to pay for the next year, so you're covered, then have them pay that company.
Okay.
Rather than say, hey, you know, the service is $100, let me give you $100 and you pay it when the bill comes in. It's about that exchange of the $100 between buyer and seller. That's why when we say pay a contractor at closing, same thing. Hey, I'm going to pay for propane. I'll give you a check for ABC propane, you know, just send it to them. Then it's a check to the company. It's not a check to the buyer. It's all about that information between buyer and seller.
Thanks.
Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So, so a couple of other things that I think are important to hit on. I want to be very mindful of everyone's time. So Lisa, quick question, but I want to hit on 2 topics before we wrap at our 11:30 time.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm going to ask another question, but here's a question I have. So my sellers have an extension on the inspection.
Yeah.
You know, the appraisal was just done too. They want to wait until the appraisal comes back before they hopefully come back before their deadline on the inspection, so they can find out whether they're gonna, you know, how much money they're in for. Is that right to do?
So I can understand that. Absolutely. You're on the seller side in this example?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So that's understandable. I think the key to it, you know, as long as all parties agree to an extension, go for it. I think the key to understand is that the seller is not required to make repairs based on an appraisal report. And that's a big common misconception out there. So the buyer's doing FHA and the report comes back saying the back of the house needs to be painted, this needs to be done, railing needs to be installed, all of this stuff. Well, there's nothing in your contract that automatically obligates the seller to making those repairs. Nowhere does it say the seller has to do it. Now, the buyer does have to get financing, but in many cases, if the buyer's financing requires certain repairs, then maybe the buyer needs to go over and paint the back of the house before closing. Maybe the buyer has to install or cause to install a handrail, whatever that is. So now that's not always easy because it's all about coordination and what have you, but don't let your seller assume it's all on them. So in your example with let's wait and see what the appraisal comes back with, it really shouldn't affect the seller. Now, if the buyer can't afford to do it, it may affect the seller, but holding off on the inspection, the appraisal is separate from that. It could be a new issue, but it's separate from the process. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
they're saying they don't, if the appraisal comes in lower than what they got, they don't want to agree to all these repairs.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And that comes down to education of your seller. Mr. Seller, regardless of the value of your home, these repairs still need to be done. So whether we do it for this buyer or a buyer we haven't met yet, we still need to get them done. How would you like to proceed?
Right. I basically told them that, especially
Yeah.
with the
Yeah, and I get that. And, you know, but by the way, their concern is real to them. So if they feel that they're not comfortable, they want to wait to make sure that it's appraises at the value because they feel that the price they receive is indicative of the expense that they'll put out, then I would just extend the time frame so that they feel comfortable.
Okay.
By the way, again, their concern is real to them. You know, if they say, well, if I get 10 grand less for this house, I'm not doing these repairs. Let's go find another buyer who will pay me that price and not ask for these repairs. You know, then extend it so you're not guessing.
Yeah.
Because their concern is valid to them. It may not make sense to us, but not everything has to make sense to us.
Okay.
Yep, great question though, thanks. So, you know, when the 2 other components I want to hit on, if you'll allow me the little bit of extra time, we spent a little time making sure everybody knew the program up front, how to use it. But there are 2 big contingencies that we're dealing with right now. Seller finds suitable housing and, you know, buyer has a house to sell. sale of buyer's property contingency. So I want to make sure that I've at least hit on those, especially when it comes time to the multiple offers. It's not easy to navigate. So the sale of buyer's property, it's also known as a Hubbard. Back many years ago, it was called kick-out. If you ever hear somebody call it a kick-out, that's what it is. And basically, that's a contingency where the buyer has a house to sell and they cannot perform on a new property until their home closes. And if you have an offer from a buyer whose house hasn't closed yet, then this contingency, and it is a form that's in the forms database, that you can look at and incorporate, where it clearly identifies the time upon which everything needs to be performed. So if a buyer hasn't sold their house, in some cases they haven't even put it on the market yet, which is a bigger concern because it takes a little while to do that. Very few sellers will agree to a sale of buyer's property contingency if the buyer's house is not yet even on the market. So but then again, the buyer doesn't want to put their house on the market until they find a house that they fall in love with, and then they fall in love with it and they get their house on the market and they lose it because their house isn't sold. It's this vicious circle, and all we can do is advise people to the nuances and the details of it so that they can make the right decisions for themselves. But the sale of buyer property contingency allows the buyer time to find a buyer for their property. It also identifies whether or not you're going to be doing inspections up front, if you're going to be waiting to do inspections until that buyer finds a buyer for their property, appraisal processes, closing dates, and what have you. So it's really important that you've seen that form and include it in your offer. If you're on the buyer side, use it as an exhibit to your offer form. Okay, it clearly identifies. Don't just write